Hey guys, it's Cass. Welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to talk about my memoir recommendations. If you've seen a video on this channel before, you'll know that I always talk about how I love to read literary fiction, essay collections, and memoirs. And I pretty much talk about literary fiction in every video. I have a video dedicated to essay collections specifically, and so I figured that it was time to make a video dedicated to memoirs. I have just around 30 books to talk about today, so I'm going to try and keep my reviews really short and to the point. If I've talked about a book in a different video, I will mention that as well so you can get my full thoughts on it there. I split the books into 8 different categories, so we're going to be talking about memoirs that are about coming of age, family, grief, mental illness, marriage and motherhood, creation of the self, diaries, and celebrity memoirs. Some of the elements might obviously overlap with different books, but I just tried to identify the main theme and group them into categories from there. And as I said earlier, if you enjoy literary fiction, essay collections, memoirs, this is the channel for you. So you should subscribe and leave a comment. Let me know what your favorite memoirs are. I feel like I read a lot of them, but I could definitely stand to add some more diverse ones into the mix. So if you have any favorites that I have not read, definitely leave them in the comments. All right, our first category is coming of age, and to kick that off, I wanted to talk about my favorite book from Annie Ernaux, and that is A Girl's Story. Now, I'm just gonna say, Annie Ernaux has so many books that could fit into different categories in this video. I'm just gonna be talking about this one. I heard you guys loud and clear in the comment section of my Deborah Levy video. People wanted Annie Ernaux to be the next author spotlight, so I will be compiling all of my thoughts about all of her books in a future video, probably like early next year, because I still have a couple that I need to get through. But yeah, Annie Ernaux is such a great memoirist. She writes a ton of really short books about her life, and this one is my favorite. So this is basically about her time at a summer camp whenever she was a teenager. She has her first sexual interaction there, and she is writing this memoir 50, 60 years after that and looking back at who she was back then and how that experience shaped her. One of the things that I think Ernaux does so well in this book, and it's such an interesting twist on this kind of story, is that she talks about how she uses writing to explore her feelings and why she kind of turns her experiences into books. She talks about using writing as a way to kind of process what has happened to her, and I just really love hearing her talk about her craft. Other than that though, this talks about desire, obviously coming of age since she was a teenager when this happened, and there's just so much self-reflection on how she has and has not changed over the 50, 60 years that have passed. This was a 5-star read for me. It was one of my favorite nonfiction books that I read last year, so I highly recommend it. Next up, we have another 5-star read that I actually read earlier this year. I talk about this book in my May wrap-up if you want to check that out and get my full thoughts on it, but I really honestly had such a hard time putting my thoughts into words about this book because I just enjoyed it so much. I don't remember if I said the book. This is Zami, A New Spelling of My Name by Audre Lorde. This follows Lorde from her early childhood through to her early 20s, growing up in the 1950s as a Black lesbian. This book talks a lot about loneliness, you know, trying to find your place in the world, figure out which community you fit in, and just really like finding your people. There are a lot of different facets of Lorde's identity that kind of intersected to isolate her a bit from others. And she had to learn how to deal with that, and she portrays that here with so much honesty and self-reflection and just so much strength. We end with her kind of having moved out of her parents' house, and she's navigating the first couple years of life on her own. This was my first time reading anything by Audre Lorde, and I feel like it is so underrated. I have not seen very many people talk about this, and I think that if you enjoy memoirs, especially like women's personal writing, this is going to be right up your alley. The writing in here is just so gorgeous, and I can't wait to dive into some of Lorde's nonfiction and poetry. I feel like she is just so talented, and there's going to be so much for me to dig into with her. Next, we have Consent by Vanessa Springora. I read this back in 2022, so it's been a little while. I don't have any like notes or review written for this, so I'm gonna just kind of go off the top of my head. In this book, Springora is talking about her relationship in the 1980s with a French writer who was much older than her. I believe that she was around 13 when their relationship started. I don't even know how old he was. Probably at least triple her age. She was obviously just so incredibly taken advantage of in this situation, and she's finally telling her story. The writer that she was, I hate to say in a relationship with, because that's just so icky in this situation, but the writer that abused her wrote about this situation for years and years and years, and nobody really did anything about it. This is just such a harrowing look into the abuse that occurred in Springora's life and the way that she just was not protected by anybody around her. So really upsetting. Beware of the content of this going into it, but super powerful, and I think a very important book in this day and age. Finally, for the coming of age category, we have Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter by Simone de Beauvoir. I read this last summer, and I believe that I rated it 4 stars. This is the first in a series of memoirs from Beauvoir, so there's a lot more content in some other books, but I haven't gotten to most of those. So in this, we get to learn about Simone's childhood and also her young adulthood. So once again, it's in the coming of age category. She's becoming a young woman in this book. We see her upbringing in France in the early 1900s, as well as her attending college and meeting Sartre. You guys, I'm taking French lessons on Duolingo, and I get scared when I have to talk to the Duolingo owl whenever they make you do like the speaking exercises. I don't think that my pronunciation has gotten any better, but I am trying. But yeah, besides this book from Beauvoir, I've also read The Prime of Life, which is the second memoir in this series. I enjoyed this one a lot more. I think that her writing style in here is a lot more like playful. I feel like we think of Beauvoir as, you know, just this very like serious philosophical figure, and so it's interesting to see how she characterizes herself as a child and as a young adult in college. There's a lot of talk about, you know, history and Parisian culture in here, so if you're into that kind of thing, I think that this is very interesting. So our next category in this video is family, and the first book that I wanted to talk about for that is I'm Supposed to Protect You from All This by Nadja Spiegelman. This was one of my first memoir reads back in 2022, and this was a 5-star for me back then. I feel like this and Crying in Mart by Zauner, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, I feel like those are the 2 books that really got me interested in reading more memoirs. So Nadja Spiegelman's father, Art, is the creator of the graphic novel about the Holocaust, Mouse. And in this book, she is talking all about her family. She talks a lot about her family history on her mom's side, and also kind of the absence of her father. She goes back through the lives of her mother and her grandmother and the hardships that they both faced while they were growing up. She also mentions in here about how, it says it in this quote on the back here, her birth was marked by an asterisk in mouse that was written by her father, and just kind of the absence, I think, of women from that story, if I remember correctly. I don't know, I haven't read it, so I could be butchering that a little bit. But yeah, I feel like this is kind of like a family saga in memoir form, if you're into that kind of thing, and just really talking about mother-daughter relationships. It's been a little while since I read it, so I don't really have a ton of like off the dome knowledge about it anymore, but yeah, I remember I really, really enjoyed this. Next, we have Jane by Maggie Nelson. This was a really interesting book. I read it for Sunny's book club last year. I think that what she does with form here is really interesting. She blends together true crime, diary, poetry, and kind of like found writings to piece together the story of her aunt. Her aunt was murdered while she was in college years and years before Maggie Nelson was born, and it's kind of been obviously an event that has cast a shadow over her family. And in this book, she is really just unpacking all of that. She's looking back at her aunt's life, trying to figure out who this young woman was that she never got to meet. Maybe try and figure out why this could have happened to her. She goes through her aunt's diaries and brings a lot of passages from those into this, which was really interesting to read and just like very touching to see just this young woman who's I was about to sound exactly like a true crime documentary there. She's so full of life, but truly from those diary entries you do see, you know, the complex life that she was leading and then had that taken away from her. And so there's kind of these themes of girlhood and this loss of innocence that take place in here that really stood out to me. I know that she has another book about the trial. I think that they like reopened the murder case, and that book is called Red Parts. I have not read it yet, but I am interested in reading that. So yeah, I think that it's cool that she combined so many different types of writing in here. I really appreciated that about this one. My last book for the family category is The Observable Universe by Heather mccalden. I read this in January of this year, so you can check out my January wrap-up for my full thoughts. Hogarth sent me a finished copy of this, so thank you to them for that. But this book is also doing some really interesting things with form. This is really fragmentary, like I'm talking short little paragraphs fragmentary. mccalden is exploring grief and the concept of the virus, both bodily and virtually. Her parents passed away from HIV/AIDS when she was young, so she has always been very fascinated by virality, and she kind of connects the disease to the internet in these really short little fragments. She's really trying to put the pieces together of who her parents were and just how she can cope with what happened to them. I really liked the longer sections in this book. Sometimes that fragmentary nature seemed a little bit stilted to me, I guess, but I think that mccalden is a really promising writer. If she does something that is more like long form chapters, I think that that's going to be really good, so I'm really excited to see what else she does. All right, my next category is grief, and I feel like this category has a lot of books that could have fit in with the family category, so we're just going to kind of mesh them together. The first book that I wanted to talk about, actually two books, I'm going to talk about these together, and those are The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion and Blue Nights by Joan Didion. I reread The Year of Magical Thinking over the summer, so I have an entire vlog dedicated to this book where I read passages from it. I talk about all of my like in real time thoughts while reading this. This is the memoir that Joan wrote in the year after her husband passed. He died really unexpectedly. One night they sat down to eat dinner. All of a sudden he wasn't talking, wasn't moving, and yeah, it was just super unexpected, and at the time that that happened, Joan's daughter Quintana was in the hospital. She was super ill and in and out of consciousness, and so yeah, she just Joan really went through a lot in this time period in the early 2000s. So speaking of her daughter, we have Blue Nights, which is about Quintana, who did end up also passing away maybe a couple years after John, her husband, did. In this book as well, Joan starts to really explore aging and acknowledge how her age has affected her and how she feels about it moving forward. She starts to get into that in The Year of Magical Thinking, but I think she really expanded on it in here. But yeah, these two books together are just such a moving picture of two of the worst things that I think could possibly happen to a person, you know, your husband passing away and your daughter passing away. But Joan does it in such a clear prose style, makes it super interesting to read. She's very analytical, and it is, I think, just a really interesting juxtaposition with the subject matter of the books. I know some people don't really love that detached style in these books specifically, but I thought that it only made the story that she was telling even more moving and affecting. Then I wanted to talk about Crying in H Mart by Michelle Zauner. This, like I mentioned, was one of the books that I think really got me into reading in general again, but also into reading memoirs. I read this very early on into my whole getting back into reading journey, and it really affected me. I remember reading like 20 or 30 pages of this during my lunch break at work on one day, and then the next day I read 20 or 30 more pages, and then I went home, sat down on the couch, and read the entire rest of this book that night. Like, did not even stop to like shower or eat or anything. I just flew through this. This is actually going to be a book that I'm going to be rereading, I think, next month. So there will be a vlog on this as well. I'm really excited to revisit it. But anyways, this is about Michelle Zauner, who is the singer of the band Japanese Breakfast. This is her memoir about the end of her mother's life. Her mother was battling cancer, and they had kind of a fraught relationship throughout the years. Michelle gets into all of that and how the relationship changed as her mother neared the end of her life. Then obviously the grief that she went through after her mother passed away. So yeah, I feel like this one is going to be a really heavy hitter whenever I reread it. I remember like sitting on the couch and like crying at parts of it. One of the things that I thought was super unique about this book was the food writing in it. Zauner and her mother always really connected over food, and she talks so much about the different recipes that her mom would make, and like the descriptions are just absolutely delicious sounding. So this book made me cry, it made me hungry, and yeah, just really beautiful. So stay tuned for further in-depth thoughts on this one. Then I wanted to talk about Seeing Ghosts by Kat Chow. This was another 2022 read. It's been, once again, a hot minute, so I don't have super detailed thoughts, but I haven't seen very many people talk about this, so I just wanted to mention it here. This book is about the untimely passing of Kat Chow's mother as well. It talks about her family history and their emigration, and I think that it also goes into Kat's relationship with her father and how that was affected by the death of her mother. So yeah, definitely like look this one up if you're interested in that kind of thing. I feel like not many people have read this, and I remember enjoying it whenever I read it, so yeah. And then the final book in the grief category is Grief is for People by Sloane Crosley. I talked about this in my July wrap-up, but it is Sloane Crosley's memoir about the death of her best friend and like work partner, Russell. She frames the story with a burglary that took place at her apartment in New York City and kind of talks about the specific kind of grief that invoked in her, and then the suicide of her best friend, and just how different those two things were, but it was just kind of this big storm of bad things that were happening in her life. I think that Crosley does a really great job of painting Russell as a full human being. She doesn't sugarcoat who he was. She also doesn't like disparage him, but she is very honest about his flaws and the complex nature of their friendship. There's also a lot of really great kind of behind the scenes writing about their work together in the publishing industry. So I thought that that was something a little bit different. They were a boss and employee for a very long time, and they have a lot of stories together about working together. So yeah, I was really like blown away by this. I'd picked it up because I've seen so many people who I trust rave about it, and I was absolutely not disappointed by it. I read it in, I think, like one afternoon. All right, our next category is mental illness, and the first book that I have for that is a book that I featured in my July wrap-up, and that is Committed on Meaning in Mad Women by Suzanne Scanlon. This talks about the time that Scanlon spent going in and out of New York State Psychiatric Institute in the 1990s. She's grappling with mental illness at the same time as she is kind of discovering who she is as an intellectual and a reader. So she brings in a lot of literary references here. She looks at a lot of different feminist literature and kind of applies that to her own life. So as someone who loves writing about books and writing, I really enjoyed that element of this. And yeah, I mean, we just see her painful experiences that she had while she was hospitalized. And then we also see how it affected her years later. We see her become a teacher and a mother, and just kind of putting the pieces of her life back together and integrating back into the world post-hospitalization. I found this really gripping. I read it in the span of 2 days, which might be a little bit intense for some people, especially if you're sensitive to, you know, the topic of mental illness. You might want to pump the brakes a little bit, but I was just really gripped by the stories that she was telling in here. I do just wish that this was edited a little bit better. I feel like there were some repetitive elements and then some things weren't really fully expanded on. So just wanted a little bit more clarity there, but overall, really enjoyed this. And then we have Girl Interrupted by Susanna Kaysen. I feel like this is kind of a classic at this point. This is about a young woman being hospitalized in the 1960s at the same institution that Sylvia Plath was at. She explores her medical records in here and just the mistreatment, I think, that was really rampant at the time in mental health institutions. She paints a picture of her fellow patients that she was there with as well. I feel like this is just kind of the like quintessential memoir about menstrual. Just feel like this book is sort of a cornerstone of the memoirs about mental health genre. I also wanted to mention the Copenhagen trilogy by Tove Ditlevsen in this category as well, specifically the last book, which I was holding up, Dependency. This series is chronicling the life of the author growing up in Copenhagen, and Dependency specifically talks about her drug addiction that was pretty much like bestowed upon her by her husband, which is just like terrifying to think about. He would basically supply her with different medicines and just kind of use that as a way to keep her compliant with him. And just like, ooh, such a like scary thing to think about, just the cycle that it got her into. The whole series is really good, but I found the Dependency was just extra harrowing. And then the last book in this category is October Child by Linda Bostrom-Knausgaard. This is written by the wife of Karl Ove Knausgaard, who is a really famous author as well. She was hospitalized in the 2010s, and this touches a little bit more on how motherhood and marriage kind of affected that experience for her. It also explores the loss of memory that she faced while she was hospitalized and how that affected her writing. And the main thing that stuck out to me here was the writing style. It was really sparse and just like so sharp and to the point, and I really enjoyed it. I feel like she's a super underrated author. I really want to read more from her. Speaking of marriage and motherhood, that is the next category, and the first books that I wanted to talk about for this is another double header here. We've got A Life's Work by Rachel Cusk and Aftermath by Rachel Cusk. I have an entire video breaking down pretty much all of Rachel Cusk's books if you have not seen it, so I talk about both of those there. But A Life's Work is basically her memoir essay collection about motherhood, and Aftermath is her memoir about marriage and her divorce. I found myself especially affected by A Life's Work. It really gave me a lot to think about as I kind of get older and think about where I want my life to go, if I want to have kids or not. She talks about the not so pretty parts of motherhood, but I find that people really over exaggerated when this book first came out, and they were like really tearing her apart for being critical of motherhood and how it affects women. I think that this was just such an honest look into the entire picture, you know, the good parts and the bad parts. So I rated this 5 stars. It was one of my favorites from last year. And then we have Aftermath, which I didn't love quite as much, but it talks about her divorce and the way that she had to kind of pick up the pieces of her life after that. She has 2 children, so that obviously had an effect on them as well. And yeah, there's a lot of kind of this rebuilding and figuring out how to move on from that situation in this book. Then we have Inferno, a memoir of motherhood and madness by Catherine Chow. This book is another one that I read quite a while ago and that I don't really see many people talking about it. This honestly would have gone really well into the mental illness category as well, because it is talking about the author's experience with postpartum psychosis. So this is another just super harrowing one. It's just really wild to think about how pregnancy and childbirth can affect women both physically and mentally, and she explores all of that in here. So I wanted to shout this one out, even though it's been a little while since I read it. Finally, in this category, we have Splinters by Leslie Jamison. I talked about this in my February wrap-up. This is another of my favorite books that I've read this year. She talks about her marriage to a fellow writer, the birth of their daughter, and then their divorce. She talks about the struggles of being a single mom who is also a working writer. There's an excerpt of this book that I think was in the New Yorker, one of those publications, but it talks about her experience on book tour with her daughter, who was like a baby at the time. Leslie's mom was on that trip with them, so one of the things that I really appreciated about this book is that it explores mother-daughter relationships from both perspectives. Leslie talks about herself as a daughter and the relationship that her and her mom had. Because her mom was also divorced, she ended up having a really friendly relationship with Leslie's father after they split, which is really in contrast to Leslie's own situation. And then Leslie obviously talks about herself as a mother to her daughter and the way that she kind of tried to recreate and push the closeness that her and her mother had on this relationship with her own daughter. So yeah, there's like a lot to unpack here. I was absolutely enthralled by this book. I think that it is probably definitely my favorite book in this category. We're losing daylight here. I cannot believe that this is taking me so long to film. Next up, I have kind of a miscellaneous category. I wasn't sure how to describe this, so I just called it Creation of the Self. I feel like these aren't quite coming of age stories, but they're more so about finding yourself as an adult. First up, we have Journal of a Solitude by May Sarton. This is exactly what it sounds like. It is her journal of the time that she spent in Nelson, New Hampshire. She had like a farmhouse there, and she lived a very solitary life, very writerly lifestyle. A lot of wisdom about being alone and making that kind of work for you, and a lot of musings about the craft of writing. So I really enjoyed this one. I think that it's a great fall time read as well. Then we have Arrangements in Blue, Notes on Loving and Living Alone by Amy Key. This was a contender to be, I think, in my top 10 favorite nonfiction books last year. I don't think that it quite made it there, but Amy Key in this book is using Joni Mitchell's album Blue as kind of a backdrop of this exploration of her particular experience with loneliness. She is in her 40s and has not really had a like lasting, meaningful romantic relationship. So she talks about that and kind of coming to terms with that, and the ways that she has filled her life with other things and made this meaning for herself outside of this romantic ideal that society pushes on us. So I thought that this was very like comforting to read, to be honest with you. Just like seeing a woman who is fully embodying what it means to be yourself and be by yourself. I feel like there's so many great lessons to be learned from Amy Key in this book. Then we have Daybook by Anne Truitt. I read this, I think, back in February as well. This is subtitled The Journal of an Artist, so it talks about Anne's work as a sculptor. I believe she's in her late 50s in this book, and she is kind of grappling with her kids growing up and leaving the home, grappling with what her work as an artist means and how her career is going to evolve as she continues to age. One of the things that I found really interesting in here is, since Anne was a bit older when she was writing this, she is watching her daughter become a mother, and I feel like that's not a perspective that I have seen too much in writing. So I thought that her view of that experience was really touching. This wasn't my favorite book ever, but another underrated one. Haven't seen too many people read it, so if you're really into like visual arts, I think that this is a really good one to check out. And then I have another little group of books here, which if you watched my last video, these will look familiar to you. This is the Living Autobiography series by Deborah Levy. We have Things I Don't Want to Know, The Cost of Living, and Real Estate. Real Estate is my favorite of the trio. I think that the series gets better as it goes along, but basically this is a series of memoirs from Deb Levy. She is reflecting on her own experience with marriage and motherhood and divorce, and there's a lot of discussion about like property ownership in here as well, especially in Real Estate. She talks about the room of one's own concept from Virginia Woolf and kind of plays off of that. So yeah, just really talking about herself as a woman, making space in the world and doing her work. And yeah, I really want to reread these three so that I can kind of collect my thoughts a little bit better. All right, our next category is diaries. And the first book that I have for this is Reborn, Early Diaries 1947 to 1963 by Susan Sontag. I have only read Susan Sontag's diaries. I haven't fully read any of her actual like writing work, but I was absolutely obsessed with this book when I read it last year. It was one of my favorite nonfiction books of 2023. We follow Susan from her like teenage years through to her early 30s, and I was just so enamored by the voice of young Susan Sontag. The thoughts that she had about growing up and love and relationships were just very relatable and relevant to me whenever I read this last year, and I underlined so much from this. She is really funny in her different observations about people and about herself especially. She really does a lot of self-exploration in here, and I just had such a great time with this book. Then we have Alphabetical Diaries by Sheila Heti. I believe that this was in my January wrap-up this year. This is the first Sheila Heti that I have read, and she's doing some really interesting things with form here. This isn't your typical diary like Susan Sontag's, where it's going in chronological dated order. Sheila Heti took her diaries from a span of 10 years and alphabetized all of the sentences in them. Once I got into the rhythm and the style of this book, I really, really enjoyed it. You can't really follow a linear progression of events in Heti's life, but you can try. You can try and piece things together. I think that where this is really valuable is the different groupings of ideas. Because it's alphabetized, you really get to see what Sheila's thoughts are on certain people and ideas, and I just think that it's interesting to see all of the sentences that start with the same word in one place. For example, I believe is the longest chapter in this because she's writing a diary, so she's talking about herself a lot. So you have all of these I statements, and it's just really fun to kind of try and piece together what is going on in her life and who she is from these sentences that aren't connected to each other. They could be written, 10 years apart. So there's also just so many like great one-liners in here that are really funny and relatable. And yeah, I thought that this was a very successful experiment with the diary form. Then our last diary related book is Ongoingness, The End of a Diary by Sarah Manguso, which I apparently bought on September 16th, 2023 for $9.99. So that's great. This book talks about Sarah Manguso, who kept a diary pretty much all of her life. She obsessively documented her thoughts and her day-to-day, and whenever she has a child, that practice comes to an end. So this is an exploration of memory and time, and motherhood as well comes into play here, as it does with a lot of these books. She finds herself forgetting things, and she finds that she just has a different relationship with this self-documentation that she has done all of her life. So yeah, this was a 5-star read for me. I find that it hasn't stuck as much as I would have wanted it to, but I really love Sarah Manguso. I think that she's a really strong author. So yeah. All right, we have 3 more books to talk about. It's getting dark and just like cloudy here. I think it's gonna rain, so hopefully the lighting isn't too bad. But our last category is celebrity, which admittedly is not really a subgenre that I read a lot of. I'm not really a big celebrity memoir kind of person, but I am a Britney Spears person. So we have The Woman in Me by Britney Spears. I feel like if you have been on the internet in the past year, you know about this book. Britney is talking about her conservatorship, where her father basically had complete control over her life and her money. She just very recently got out of it and was able to write about that experience. This is a really wild exploration of fame and what money and power can do to people, and just how mistreated she was. The people in her life just absolutely did not protect her and did not put her first. They only cared about themselves and the money that they could make from her. And as someone who has loved Britney Spears genuinely since I came out of the womb, like there are home videos of 2-year-old Cass dancing and singing to Oops, I Did It Again. Like, I love her. This was just so impactful to read. Obviously I think we all kind of knew that some not great things were going on with her, but to hear it come from her directly was just absolutely shocking. So I'm really glad that she was able to finally tell her story, and I hope she's doing well. Next, we have Eve's Hollywood by Eve Babbitt. I put this in this category because these are a lot of stories from Eve's time in Hollywood. Obviously, it's called Eve's Hollywood. This isn't like 100% focused on celebrities, but there is kind of that like rock and roll lifestyle of the 60s and 70s that Eve was involved in that culture. So I feel like this fit in here. I am gonna be honest with you, I don't really remember too much from this, but Babbitts is someone that I want to explore a little bit more. Spoiler alert for a future video. So yeah, I feel like if you're into just like short, fun snapshots of like 60s and 70s LA, this would be really interesting to you. And finally, we have a book that I'm really just putting in here for me personally. I don't know that it's gonna have mass appeal, but that is None of This Rocks by Joe Troman. Joe is the guitarist of Fall Out Boy. Fall Out Boy is my favorite band of all time. So obviously I had to read this and put in tabs on every single page, every mention of Pete Wentz or Patrick Stump or Andy Hurley. Don't worry, I have it documented here, but I'm not gonna harp on this too much, but I love Joe. Talks about his childhood, talks about his struggles with depression, especially while Fall Out Boy was on hiatus back in the early 2010s. So that was really upsetting to read about one of my favorite musicians going through such a difficult time. But yeah, he is just so funny and just seems like such a good guy, and he makes great music, so we love Joe. All right, I've been filming for over an hour. Who knows how long the edited video is gonna be, but if you have made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you got some helpful suggestions from this. I hope that I was able to shed some light on some lesser known books as well. And like I said, if you have any recommendations for me, please let me know. Always looking for a good memoir to add in my TBR. Would also love to talk to you about any of these books if you've read them as well. So yeah, let's chat, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.